Today you'll hear a true crime story that takes place over 50 years in the past. The siblings who made national news after a 6-week killing spree. A spree that could have been avoided. This is the true life story of the Penn Brothers.
We never really had a sound.
This is Melt the Mic right here. We're in the heart of Richmond, VA.
They got gangs, roaches.
Yes, it was the deadliest invasion since the Civil War.
Killers, dope.
Drug-related shootings in Richmond.
We knew what we couldn't do, so we were forced to be original.
Now here we have two black boys being raised up by their father, William Penn Sr., and their mother, Mrs. Mary Penn, living in the heart of Churchill in Richmond, Virginia. The oldest, William Penn Jr., will be born the year 1941, with Thomas Penn being born 6 years later in 1947. As you can imagine, the mid to late 50s were a horrible time period to be black in America. Life for black children was shaped by the cold realities of racial segregation. But if it's one thing they had that the city lacks seeing today, it would be community. One band, one sound, which you kind of had to be back in those days in the name of survival. You could say that they were raised inside a home where violence, discord, and insecurity prevailed over the more positive qualities that you would see within a healthy family. Becoming the product of a broken home as their father would abandon their mother while they were still little boys. They were also on welfare, and their assigned caseworker would say that Thomas and his mother's relationship wasn't good at all, having the impression that his mother rejected him. And so, domestic disputes between their parents became a weekly tradition. Nevertheless, this all but caused mental wear and tear on them both. At some point in growing up, they would move to a small town inside the county of Brunswick, Virginia, a town called Lawrenceville, but eventually they made way back to home base. Now the more radical of the two, being Thomas Penn, in the early 60s, he starts showing signs of behavioral issues, wreaking havoc inside the home, around the neighborhood, and even in school, eventually leading him to being arrested for the first time at the age of 12 years old. But they noticed this wasn't the normal boys will be boys behavior you'd normally see in troubled children. So in 1962, Thomas would be confined to the Memorial Guidance Clinic. And here's where he meets Dr. George Lordy, who was told that his new patient Thomas was beyond parental control, with authorities having real concerns about his mental health. After receiving psychiatric evaluations, Dr. Lordy came to the conclusion that Thomas was psychotic, moreover, a paranoid schizophrenic. Even medical staff would describe Thomas as having hostile and violent tendencies, figuring that a portion of said issues were the cause of an unhappy family life. So Dr. Lordy would refer him to Central State Hospital in Petersburg, Virginia for further studies and treatment. And from that moment on, he would go through a series of examinations from age 12 to 14 years old. Among the many psychologists Thomas talked to, one of them named Robert Halstead felt that Thomas was severely disturbed and on the brink of psychosis. He all but warned them that this severe disturbance would continue unless he had intensive help. But the Central State Hospital, for reasons unknown, had discharged Thomas as not mentally ill. And this was a grave decision that would later become detrimental to a lot of people in the city of Richmond. Now, any sane human being will ask questions and wonder why. Well, first, you'd have to understand what it really meant to be admitted to a place like Central State. A place with a dark past and buried secrets. And there's really no truth to it, but Thomas Penn's time here may have caused his mental condition to be worse than the day he came in. This facility was named the Central Lunatic Asylum upon opening day, but in attempts to change the image of mental hospitals is how we come to know it as Central State several years after. But that wasn't the only changes. In the wake of Jim Crow, this place would become the very first colored-only mental facility in Virginia, and immediately began taking black patients from other asylums. The facility had over 4,800 patients who endured the type of treatment you'd rather not imagine. But the reasons people were sent here made the experience so much worse. If you were black back in the 60s, you could be committed here for things such as getting an abortion, not getting along with an employee, being on the wrong side of the street, being too old with no place to go, talking back to a police officer, typhoid fever, emancipation, masturbation, and even marriage. And once you were here, there was a chance you had the heinous pleasure of being sterilized against your will. A permanent solution to stop reproduction of institutionalized people. But you have to remember, this hospital, like many others, were ran by former Confederate white slave owners who believed that hard work and violence would cure their patients. And while we don't have a record of Thomas's stay, whatever happened to him stayed with him. Some patients were tortured, several were killed, and others would commit suicide. So if his own pain didn't keep him up at night, the screams and moans of others would.
Records show that attendants frequently hit patients, locked them in closets, and restrained them for long periods of time. Even medical practitioners believe that patients could be cured through confinement or punishment.
But who's to say Thomas wasn't just another kid who dealt with depression from his neglected childhood? Racism made it easy to diagnose anyone as mentally ill. But if that were the case, it was now too late. As of today, the facility still offers forensic psychiatry while also housing the criminally insane for the Richmond area. But now, this place was considered nothing more than haunted.
Central State Mental Institution, one of the most haunted sites in our state, and it was a little creepy. It was just kind of was in the air.
Thomas would eventually go back home and reunite with William after his final release, but only after the next chain of events does the thought of Thomas being back in regular society considered a horrible idea. It's now the year 1966, and it's close to breaking into the springtime. As they got older, both would get into numerous odd jobs and occupations. Thomas is now 19 and William was 25. Both brothers would be employed by the firm N.W. Martin & Bros. Inc. in the beginning of that year. Now, William started working here just a year prior in June of 1965, landing a position as a truck driver. Whether Thomas started at the same time as his brother or even held the same position is unknown. And throughout their time here, they crossed paths with the sheet metal worker, a man named James Carter Sr., who's been employed here for the past 5 years. The nature of their relationship to James would be irrelevant for the moment. But within the few months going ahead, neither of the Penn brothers would have a job here anymore, and the loss of their jobs were never explored as a pivotal moment for them, but more so for the youngest, Thomas Penn, because sometime after, Thomas would do a little shopping, so to speak. He ended up visiting a local gun store during open business hours and casually walked behind the counter, stealing a pair of .22 caliber pistols, and walked right out the door. No running, sound the alarms, or suspicion. It was as if he was never there, but yet he still needed bullets for the guns, figuring it wasn't enough time to grab those along with the pistols. So he chose to travel outside of Richmond to purchase some ammunition for it. Now, we don't know if this were a plan cooked up by both the brothers or just Thomas himself, because Thomas had lost his source of income weeks before William, and because of his mental illness, it wasn't crazy to think he would go to such an extreme to support himself. Or was what he was about to do rooted in supporting himself at all? Maybe Thomas had just lost it. Moving on to the day of March 9th, the eldest, William, would plan to link up with the girl he knew at the Harrison Hotel. Before he could enter the hotel, he would run into his brother Thomas between Clay and 2nd Street. And Thomas says he was going to make him some money that night. Now watching his little brother walk up the street a shorter ways, he entered a motel parking lot close by, with William not knowing what he actually meant by making some money. But for a moment, he naively thought his brother was just kidding, playing around, until Thomas enters the building. Now at the time, the building he went into was called the Eagleston Motel, located at 604 North 2nd Street. So Thomas now standing inside the motel lobby, there stood a 78-year-old black man standing behind the counter. His name was Moselle Leon Spencer. When he wasn't filling his role as a night clerk, he was a part-time minister for his church. But Thomas had no picks. He raised his black pearl handle .22 to the man, demanding money out of the register. When William makes way into the lobby at the same time, he was shocked at what his brother was doing, begging him not to shoot. But Thomas had no intentions on leaving empty-handed. While demanding Moselle to empty his pockets, he then forced him to give a portion of that money to his brother. William was a little relieved, thinking it was over, so he turned to exit the building, and there was Thomas, still with his gun drawn at the old man, backing him up into the office, and William saw his chance to finally stop him, attempted to wrestle the gun away from him, but Thomas pushed his brother away and proceeded into the office. William, not having a clue what to do next, he ran out, and after a few steps outside the motel, he heard it. One gunshot. After killing this man in cold blood, he rips the money tray from the register before bolting out of the nearest exit. They would then leave together in the vehicle that William had previously rented. On the way home, They would have to cross the 14th Street Bridge. They stopped the car midway so Thomas could get rid of the money tray he stole. He dumped everything into a bag, then slings it over the bridge into the James River. After, they travel a short ways toward William's home, which was located off of East 15th Street in the South Side, an area where the Blackwell housing projects would be built 4 years from that time. And what's more crazy is that this plot of land where William lives would be home to several members of the Johnson and Brown gang. Before the brothers reach their destination, Thomas shouts at his older brother, saying, "Keep your mouth shut." Now, even though William tried stopping the robbery, Thomas wasn't selfish with the reward, divvying up the rest of the cash with William. Overall, it was a grand total of $78, which today is worth a little over $750. Back at the crime scene, shortly before 1 a.m., the night clerk Moselle was found on the second floor landing of the motel, a short distance away from the disarranged office where the money was taken, including trails of blood found in numerous places throughout the premises. While detectives worked on the area as if it was just another day on the job or another murder in the city, no one could have guessed that in this moment, that two young brothers had officially kicked off an unplanned killing spree. Now, we could imagine that William was considered a liability in the eyes of Thomas. It was thought that he wasn't willing to go to the same lengths, not having the heart to actually take a life, and on the surface, it would seem so. It was also said to be a well-calculated plan, a plan that William was well aware of, but only to the point of taking the money and not snatching a life. Because William was what you would say more approachable than Thomas, polite even. But even with those qualities, William would soon cross over to the dark side in the weeks to come. March 19th, 1966, it's a week and a half later, William's original plan to rent a car for a trip to Lawrenceville was back in motion, but alongside his younger brother Thomas as well. And they would wind up at a business in downtown Lawrenceville that operated as a service station and a lunch counter, Pearson's One Stop. And as Thomas and William Penn purchased a few items, they run into another pair of brothers named Henry and Arthur Reeves. This led to an all-out brawl inside the service station. Now, what and why this transpired between them was unknown, but it's speculated that they all knew each other from a past situation. In the end, the Penn brothers wound up in the hospital. They were treated for several bruises and cuts. Then weeks later, they were arrested for their role in the fight. But it was short-lived as they would post bond that same day. And it was now time to go back home to Richmond. But a subpoena to testify against the Reeves brothers in court on June 15th would bring them back. But neither of the brothers would ever make it. 3 quiet weeks passed by with no peep from neither of the Penn brothers. William had severed ties with his previous job at the Martin and Bros firm in the month of April, now working at Johnson & Willis Hospital alongside his father, William Sr. Thomas left the firm as well, but his specific reasons on why were unknown. Now, on the spring Thursday of April 14th would be the last day a woman named Sally Pittman would see her 21-year-old son, Willie Sexton, alive. They lived off the 2800 block of East Broad Street inside of Churchill, not far from where the Penn brothers spent their childhood. And at some point during that day, he was approached by the brothers, who were still driving around in William's rental car. And after a little conversation with Willie, they convinced this young man to let them drop him off at his destination. It's unclear on why he would trust these guys so willingly, but a wild guess would be because of the racial tension in the air. This was a time when blacks were held back, but also at their strongest because they worked as one. So who's to say this wasn't the norm for the black community to offer help, just as much as they accepted it? But even if that was the case, Willie would soon find out that these were the wrong brothers to accept any help from. With William behind the wheel, they were going north along Creighton Road when he suddenly stopped the car at a creek connected to the Chickahominy River. Thomas would step out the car and ordered Willie to do the same. Now, with his pistol aimed to Willie's back, he directed him toward the creek, at which time he shoot Willie 9 times in the back with the same small caliber weapon he used to kill Moselle just a month prior. After robbing the man of everything he had, his body was thrown into a creek bed. 3 days later, on April 17th, it was around 4 p.m. when 2 young boys riding their bikes along Creighton Road discovered Willie's remains. Moselle Spencer's death didn't strike much fear in the city when it first happened, because it was viewed as random and senseless violence. But the saga of the Penns first became public attention the day Willie's body was fished out of that body of water. They wouldn't have eyes on the brother specifically, but there were facts about the cases that somewhat connected, which were the .22 caliber shells and the man's pockets turned inside out. But that was it. It was too early to determine a specific pattern. It wasn't race-based, no eerie messages left behind, and there was no real timetable to say when they picked their victims. But if anything, that need to kill just grew more and more as the body count rose. But this time, it was just Thomas, out on a hunt, alone. On the day of May 8th, 1966, a 16-year-old girl by the name of Cynthia Johnson would be hanging out with her 22-year-old boyfriend, Oscar Henderson, spending the majority of the day together from 3 till about 11:30 that night. By then, the couple was standing on the corner of 25th and Venable Street. They were sharing a cigarette before getting into a brief argument, leading to Cynthia wanting to go home. Before she leaves, Oscar gives her 90 cents, along with the pack of Marlboros that he had just bought. Then she'd walk away in the direction of 26th and Q Streets, making her way home alone, which would be a 20-minute walk that covered more than 10 blocks. And Oscar's decision to not accompany his girlfriend may have created the catalyst for the horrible event that comes next, because neither of them were aware that someone had been watching the entire time. And that was Thomas, lurking in the shadows as he stalked his next victim up the block. He would follow her for 4 blocks on the opposite side of the street for a while before catching up to her on 30th and Q Street, asking her, "Hey, where you going?" And Cynthia replied, "I'm going home." We could only imagine how scared she was, because here was a tall, slim, average-looking guy creeping up behind her in the dead of night, with no one else around. Thomas was dressed down in a light green ballet shirt, a pair of light gray dress pants, and his hair was styled into what they called back in those days as a conch. He walked and talked with Cynthia till they were a half a block away from her street. And this would be the moment Thomas drew out his gun. Aimed toward her back, he would tell her, "You have to go." And at first, she wouldn't resist, but the sight of another man walking up the street in her direction gave her a bit of hope. She then struggled to break loose from Thomas as the man advanced toward them even more. But the gun inside Thomas's hand caused the man to retreat, choosing self-preservation over playing the role of a hero. So Thomas, not taking any chance on her slipping away, would walk her 2 to 3 blocks over into a wooded area. Back then, this wooded area was nicknamed Dead Man's Canyon. They approached the tree line where the woods ended, and once inside, Thomas held that same black pearl handle .22 as he did on the others. Cynthia tried stalling him as she begged for mercy, going on about her abusive household, specifically about her stepdad trying to beat on her, then the recent argument with her boyfriend. But unexpectedly, Thomas would actually level with her, listening to her very attentively as if he resonated with her pain, almost like an older brother. And after he learned of what she was dealing with, he would tell her, "This is the best way out." In that moment, Cynthia would have realized that she wasn't pleading with the person of sound mind or empathy. So no matter what she said, Thomas knew in his mind that she was never to make it out of Dead Man's Canyon this evening. He responds again saying, "God called on you," rationalizing this terrifying moment for a child as a call of duty, as if he were doing her the favor. No soon after does he unload 9 shots in her direction, but only striking her twice in the chest. As Cynthia lay on the ground, positioned on her stomach, she'd ask for some air while desperately gasping for her breath. Thomas then says to her, "It's your time to go. God called you home." He then removed her black scarf, a cream-colored coat she had on, and tosses it a few yards away, which in his mind was the least he could do for her. In the future, his answer on why he killed her would shed light on just how much his mind had deteriorated by this point. His lawyer would ask him, what did he mean when he told Cynthia this is the best way out? And he would say, "It seemed to me living in this world is living in the world full of problems. Some people can't cope with them. I can't cope with them." While Cynthia lays there still alive, he takes her ID card, a keychain, then a pack of Marlboro cigarettes and 90 cents given to her by Oscar, leaving her to bleed out in those dark woods alone, taking a full 20 to 30 minutes for her to actually succumb to her wounds. He made his way home, which on record says 1201 North 26th Street. He would burn her ID card, the same as he did for his past victims, and any more that was to come. But later in the investigation, no one could figure out why he would do it. Cynthia's face was known around the neighborhood. She attended school regularly, along with the 2-parent household. There was no real reason to do so unless it was to get rid of evidence, but that would also be debunked, because if that was true, why take it in the first place? That very next day around 6:30 p.m., Cynthia Johnson's body was found. She was lying face down, along with her blood-stained coat just a few feet away from her body. The detective on scene thought the clothes she had on were, and I quote, torn up rather severely, as if she had been engaged in a struggle. So the initial thoughts were her being sexually assaulted. There were no clear indications that he did, but because of what he would do to a future victim, they never ruled it out as a possibility. Now, following these 3 murders, the Penn brothers went into overdrive. No stopping, no breaks. From here on out, it was one death after the other. There's been a vague illustration of William's role throughout this story. During the robbery of Thomas's first victim, Moselle, he supposedly just so happened to be there, even against taking the man's life. In the murder of Willie Sexton, William was only the driver, a facilitator, if you will, because in order for Thomas to do the deed, William must have agreed to give the man a ride. Lastly, he wasn't present at all in the death of Cynthia Johnson. So again, we ask ourselves, who is William Penn? At this juncture, he seems to only be his brother's keeper. But what happens when the lone keeper develops a taste for it, a temptation, or an urge like his dear old brother Thomas? Well, it's simple. He joins the hunt. Just a few days after Thomas brutalized a 16-year-old girl, he would get into a heated altercation with someone, a person that his brother William became quite fond of. But it definitely went far beyond just a simple altercation. Thomas and William were at the apartment of a 55-year-old woman named Frances Oliver, who lived in the Fulton Hill neighborhood. It's unclear on what happened between the two, but at some point during the visit, Thomas tries to shoot Frances, all while her 2 teenage daughters were inside the home. But yet again, because big brother William steps in and stopped him, Frances was unharmed. She made it clear that Thomas wasn't welcome back over again. If we remember, the Penn brothers previously worked alongside a man named James Horace Carter at the Martin and Bros firm 2 months back. Well, on May 20th, 10 days after Cynthia Johnson's death, that same man had just picked up his payroll check of about $135. James then calls his wife shortly after 5 p.m., as he always did on payday, and asked her for a grocery list, which included a sirloin, 2 round steaks, and per his routine, he goes to the same supermarket as always, which was a market off of 23rd and Jefferson Avenue, then leaving out a little after 5:30. Upon leaving the supermarket, he was approached by the Penn brothers. It's assumed that William no longer had his rental car, and because of their previous relationship with James, he didn't mind giving them a ride, but they would end up having a couple of drinks together. Then after, James found himself driving down State Route 5 toward Henrico. They arrived to an abandoned farmhouse off of Kingsland Road in Verina, and you can guess by now that James knew that the brothers had the worst of intentions, thinking maybe if he just did what they wanted, they'll let him go. Thomas followed James into an old shack nearby as William trailed behind. The moment William entered the shack, he had an unexpected front row seat to a gruesome scene. Thomas then fires 12 bullets into the man, hitting the back of his head, stomach, and back. As his body lay on the ground, he took anything of value before driving off with his car, which was a 1958 gray Chevrolet. James would leave behind a wife, his 4 daughters, and his son, an entire family who laid in wait for James to return home. Had no reason to think of the worst, but the next few days would change their perception of the situation. With William behind the wheel, the brothers took the 20-minute-long drive back to the city. In the back seat sat the bags of the groceries James' wife had sent for him. So before they did anything else, William decided to drop the food off at home with his wife, and several other things from James' car. And what would seem as a harmless act in William's mind would be the missing pieces to a bizarre puzzle for a few detectives. On the same day of James's murder, it was well into the night as William made his way back to Fulton. Frances would invite William only to her birthday party, making a point that Thomas was not allowed to attend. But moments after William arrived, his brother Thomas called for him to come out to the car, at which time William was asked to leave at Mrs. Oliver's request, remembering just how brutal his little brother could be. So she refused to have him anywhere near her or her family. So as William left the apartment, Frances and her teenage daughter Verona had seen William get inside a car they remembered Thomas driving earlier that day, a vehicle they thought looked very familiar, and that was the car originally owned by James Carter. Unbeknownst to Frances and her daughters, the brothers planned to use that very car to go back out on a hunt. It was all suspicious to Frances, but her suspicions transformed into fear after hearing about a very similar car being found engulfed into flames just hours later. And the events that would lead up to this started right after the Penns left her home, setting their sights down Forest Hill Avenue. With William at the wheel as always, he turned to his little brother and says, "We're going to get another one." It was pretty close to midnight as the brothers made way to the south side. Thomas would see someone walking down the sidewalk in the same direction that they were driving. This man was 20-year-old Addison E. Wilkins. After pointing Addison out to William, he pulled up beside him. Thomas calls him to the car, and William would ask him if he had minded showing him to Laburnum Avenue, but he had nervously informed the brothers he was on his way to the club, having a bad feeling about them from the beginning. But yet, he would still agree to William's request. He then asked if they were at least going to bring him back, and of course, William assured him he would. They reached Laburnum Avenue. Addison asked if William knew where the club was located. William responded that he did, and that it was just a little further down the road. But there was this serious red flag that Addison failed to notice. He had never stated which club he planned to go to, the name, or even the address for that matter. But Addison, not thinking much of it, he trusted that they would get him to where he was going. William turns off onto a back street headed toward Oakwood Cemetery, and they stumble upon an area where the ground was recently excavated. And in 2 years' time, this plot of land would be known as the Villas of Oakwood, an apartment complex that opened up in 1968. Now William would suddenly stop the vehicle, complaining about trouble with the car. He got out and would act as if he were checking under the hood. Then Addison turned to Thomas and asked, "What are y'all going to do?" Thomas's response, "I'm going to send you to a resting place." You could just imagine the fear running up this young man's spine after hearing those fatal words. Thomas exits the vehicle and asks Addison to do the same, with William following suit. Upon reaching the hole in the ground, Thomas stood behind him with the gun to his back. Big brother William walks up to them both and casually raised his gun. It was almost deliberate, like raising your hand to turn off a light switch. Not wasting a moment, he shoots him point blank range in the head. As Addison's body lay inside the hole, Thomas had gave his brother a look. He may have been surprised or just didn't expect it, being that Thomas was the only killer of the two thus far. He turned his attention back to Addison, firing 6 more bullets into his body, which was clear overkill at this point. Before leaving, Thomas would take any valuables Addison had on his person, which included a watch, $11 in cash, and his ID card. He would later say that he took the money because at that moment, he couldn't spend it anyway. After killing Addison Wilkins, they left the scene and made way over town, right back out on the hunt for their next victim. It was the wee hours of the morning as they drove down West Broad Street. Thomas spotted a man walking in the opposite direction and pointed him out to William. He made a U-turn at the next intersection and pulled up alongside him. And it was a 41-year-old man, tall, kinda slender, named Malcolm Norman Jr. Thomas would ask if he was going to the bus station. After confirming that he was, they offered him a ride, telling him to get in the car. And just as his previous victims, Addison Wilkins and William Sexton, did, he accepted that offer. Maybe he thought of it as a kind gesture from two strange men at 4 or 5 in the morning. Who knows? He got into the front seat and sat between them both, saying he was planning on going to Williamsburg, Virginia. And as William turned off on Broad Street, he claimed to be more than happy to take the trip. So upon leaving, they made their way back across town to the spot where Thomas called Addison's resting place. And again, William suddenly stopped the car. But Malcolm caught on pretty fast. In his mind, he knew what was to come next. Thomas opens the door for him to exit the vehicle, commanding him to get out. After doing so, Malcolm made a last-ditch effort to escape, running toward an open field. But he wouldn't make it far as Thomas grabbed the man mid-stride, now walking him inside the dig site. Then William wasted no time as he paced around the car toward them, shooting Malcolm once in the back of the head, with the bullet just grazing the man's scalp. Malcolm now grabbing for his chest, trying to mumble something to Thomas. Then together in unison, they shoot him a total of 10 to 11 times. Malcolm falls down into the hole, and Thomas climbs inside afterward to adjust him. He would reposition his lifeless body, jerking him down a bit further toward Addison's body, attempting to prolong the discovery of their victims. In the midst of Thomas's efforts, William got back in the car to start it up. Taking the same road they came in on, they came out the back end of Fulton Hill, and as of now, they had just murdered 3 individuals within a 24-hour period, using James Carter's vehicle, the man they slayed just the day before, to facilitate the murders of the last 2 victims, Addison and Malcolm. So that car they were driving was beyond hot, and William, he knew this. So he turned to his baby brother, telling him they had to ditch the car, and he had a plan on the best way how, and that was driving it into the James River. And a 5-minute drive away, they arrived at the docks just before dawn, but couldn't make a move because someone had been out there. So the brothers waited for them to leave for about 15 to 20 minutes, but they wouldn't budge. He ditched the original plan with them now saying they would have to burn it. After filling and purchasing a gas can, they wound up parking the car not too far away on Nicholson Street, just under a railroad track that runs through the Shockoe Bottom district. They doused James's car, lit a match, and fled the scene. It's been a long night and was well into the early morning of May 21st with the sun on the rise. William will go back to Francis' apartment in Fulton Hill, with Thomas traveling to his own home on the north side. And the first thing Thomas would do was burn the ID cards taken from the victims, using the built-in heater inside his home. He broke the watch he stole into several pieces, then discarded the watch inside his own trash can, saying because he had already had one, it wasn't worth keeping. And this is referring to the watch that was taken from the 4th victim, James Carter. 2 to 3 hours later, around 7:30 a.m., the Oliver family had awakened, noticing that William Penn was back inside the apartment. And it wouldn't be long before James's vehicle led to a random citizen calling it in, finding the car abandoned and still on fire just outside the Fulton neighborhood. But the owner of said car wouldn't be found till several days afterward. Now 4 hours after William leaves is when Francis would hear about it, oblivious of William's role in it. But the thought of William being involved would seem almost impossible to them. Then there was the discovery of Addison and Malcolm at the construction site, the south edge of the roadbed on 36th and East Richmond Road, near Oakwood Cemetery. But an eerie fact of this road is that there would be multiple bodies dumped along this street in the years to come. Apparently it was seen as a discreet enough location to conceal a corpse. And who knows, maybe the cemetery sitting just yards away played some role in it. And now, the Penn Brothers' devious activities hit the news for the entire city to see. The officer found no identification or money on either bodies, and the pockets of the victims had been turned wrong side outwards. This may remind you of his previous victims who were found the same way. Now, stashing their bodies inside an open construction site was more of a convenience than it was strategic. And unlike the sexual deviant variety of killers such as Dahmer, Bundy, or the Cleveland Strangler, Thomas would say that there was no thrill or sexual satisfaction from him taking their lives. As a matter of fact, right after killing these men alongside his brother, he'd say that he knew something must have been wrong with him. Thomas displayed all the signs of a deteriorating mental state, and the hospital that released him less than a year prior would come to want no parts of the issue when it all hits the fan. The following day rolls around, and the events that would unfold conjured up a brief moment of deja vu in the minds of everyone following the 6 unsolved murders. Because the facts of this next situation were so similar to one another that if you didn't read the names, you might have mistaken it for the original. Because Thomas will go out on his own again. Another devious solo mission that would contradict his own words in the near future. May 22nd, 1966. It was close to 11 p.m. and a 14-year-old black girl named Johnny Mae Hicks would be with her boyfriend Eugene Willis at his apartment in Creighton Court, located at 2019 North 29th Street. Now on this night, Johnny and Eugene were actively having a fight, right there in the moment, while Thomas had been watching the entire conflict play out just a block away. Thomas then approaches the couple, informing Johnny that he was a detective, and he would ask, "Is this man bothering you?" And she responded in agreement that Eugene was, saying she was about to call the police, but Thomas warned her that his own mother had already done so. Now whether or not Johnny caught on to this clear contradiction is never confirmed, but it would seem that Eugene did, because at that moment, Eugene went inside the apartment to get a friend of his named Purcell, at which time Thomas had grabbed her hand and started running with her into an open field. And by the time they got there, Eugene and Purcell were coming out of the front door, trailing behind. Both would jump a fence nearby to look for Johnny, and they were met with 3 gunshots from Thomas's .22. Thomas had ran away from the field, so it was thought that the worst was over. The strange, bad man with the gun was gone. But it was far from over. After all of that, Eugene will walk Johnny home, but yet he leaves her at the door by herself. A similar decision made by Cynthia's boyfriend Oscar when he would decide to not accompany her on the 10-block stretch home from the store, which made her an easy target for a predator like Thomas. And I think we can all agree that after such an extreme episode, it was almost heartless to just up and leave your companion alone at night. Maybe it was because of their fight. Eugene may have felt a certain way about Johnny accusing him of bothering her, but there's no way of knowing what type of relationship they actually had, especially for her to be contemplating accepting help from a total stranger. So as Johnny stood at her front door, she reconsidered calling the police, now making way to the phone booth at the end of her street. On the way there, she would see Thomas leaning on side a house in the neighborhood known as the Ice Cream House, taking the chance to walk aside her to the phone booth. But then he warned her for a second time, saying, "If you make the call, there's gonna be a lot of trouble." The two then went back to Johnny's home, and after a brief moment, Thomas would then suggest she go back to the phone booth, telling her that she should call the police, just in case her boyfriend Eugene came back around starting another disturbance. At this point, let's imagine that Johnny is just truly afraid for her life, figuring that doing whatever he asks would spare her from whatever horror was to come. Now en route back to the phone booth, a car made its way toward them in oncoming traffic. Thomas all but convinced Johnny that it could be Eugene, so he suggested that they run around a different way instead of going straight to make it to the phone booth. And this way took them across the street inside of an open field behind Woodville Elementary School, winding up crouched behind a bush together. And while there, he said to Johnny, and I quote, "You going with me, take your clothes off." In the midst of following Thomas's directions, he would ask her if she read the newspaper, referring to the story about Cynthia Johnson being killed not too far away from their location. And Johnny's response was, "Yes, I do." Then he would casually tell this young girl verbatim, "I was the one that killed her. I killed her, and the two men in the cemetery. Cynthia died in the darkness, but you will die in the light." He proclaimed to be a sex maniac, telling her she would be his 20th victim. And from this point on, Thomas went on to rape Johnny May. Then after, he raped her again. And now that he was done, he drew his .22 and shot the teenager twice, being hit in her left ear, left cheek, and left wrist, which is consistent with someone in a defensive position, holding up her left hand to shield herself. Afterward, Thomas used the tube of eyeliner he had found on her to write Sniper 20 on both her thighs, leaving Johnny May for dead. Now in most cases, even the victims knew that their hands wouldn't help much in terms of saving you from a bullet, but it's instincts, a lizard brain reaction. But in Johnny May's case, it would be rare, because she was still alive. Thomas most likely thought that it was no way she'd survive a shot to the face point blank range, but she managed to get up, get herself together enough to reach her home and call the police, now under medical care at St. Philip Hospital. And Johnny May's survival would break the case wide open. It's the following day, the Monday of May 23rd, 1966, and the attack of Johnny May Hicks would be fresh in the minds of everyone in the community. Now, a 14-year-old girl in between an angry boyfriend and a random stranger was scary enough to affect her own judgment. But there were too many red flags, too many unanswered questions, like why not go inside the house? Was her mother not home and she didn't have her own key? Was it a similar situation to Cynthia, whereas though there was a parent or step-parent abusing her, torn in between the devil she knows and the one she doesn't? While some of those questions will be answered, the why wasn't important. After her recovery, she gave a full description of her captor, but couldn't give his name. The one detail he managed to keep to himself. But today was also the day that authorities would finally locate the bullet-riddled body of 52-year-old James Horace Carter, found inside a crumbling, abandoned farmhouse off of Kingsland Road in Henrico County. And if we remember, James was killed 3 days prior on May 20th. So with the ongoing investigation into his disappearance and his car being abandoned in flames and finding his body were major leads in the case. All these events set a chain of reactions in motion. It was early on in their spree that the murders of Moselle Spencer and Willie Sexton were never connected due to the huge time gap in between them, but it didn't change the similarities of the murders. All of the victims had belongings stolen from them, like money and other miscellaneous items. 4 of them were found with their pockets pulled inside out, And lastly, all of them were killed with a .22 caliber pistol. So with the entire East End on edge, parents urged their kids to get home early, families purchasing weapons for protection, while Thomas had plans on taking a road trip to the District of Columbia. When he arrived to D.C., Thomas had one goal in mind, and that was to hide the murder weapon. And after concealing the gun with the brown paper bag, he stashed it inside the sewers in the city. But for the next 3 to 4 days, he's unaware that the case of the 6 unsolved murders had grown legs. The Richmond Times-Dispatch covered every aspect of the case, and Thomas would do the same, obsessively reading morning papers in search of his work. Now the police went looking for answers, and they wouldn't have to go far. And on the day of May 28th, police had a warrant for Thomas's arrest, charging him with rape and malicious wounding of Johnny May. And right from the beginning, Thomas was seen as the main force behind the past 6 weeks of terror. Now I couldn't pinpoint the exact day and time Thomas had left Richmond, how many days he stayed in D.C., or where he was even staying for that matter. But everyone in the city of Richmond would be privy to the day he returned. Because on the Sunday morning of May 29th, Thomas had been looking at TV when a breaking news bulletin came on.
He's an absolutely ruthless, completely merciless killer. He thinks killing is just killing. So somebody like that is going to be a very serious problem for us.
Officers armed with shotguns take the threat seriously. The psychotic killer has already murdered.
Thomas's face graced the screen as they informed the public about the warrant for his arrest, describing the rape and malicious wounding of Johnny May Hicks. And a few hundred miles back home, his brother William felt that pressure as well. So much so, he wrapped up the pistol he used and hid it somewhere in his house, a hiding spot that he thought was just clever enough to not be noticed. As for Thomas, he immediately made way back to Richmond. He met up with members of his immediate family, at which time his father had promised him to get him a lawyer. Then at about 7:30 a.m., together with his brother William and his father, he appeared at a Richmond police station and surrendered himself. After being read his rights, he made it clear that he didn't care to make a statement relative to anything, saying he wanted to abide by whatever his counsel would tell him to do. After a while, his father and brother left for work because both would still work alongside each other at Johnson Willis Hospital. Now, because Thomas's charges were totally unrelated to William, he figured he was in the clear for now. But even if the cops never found out about his involvement during their own investigation, there was another factor in the case that William never accounted for. It was well over an hour since turning himself over to authorities when a detective wanted to know if he needed or wanted anything, and Thomas would ask for a phone call to check in with his father. After talking for over 45 minutes, his father dropped an unexpected bomb, telling his son he refused to get a lawyer for him. The reason for his change of heart is unknown, and he speculated that he either couldn't afford one or was simply disgusted with his son's actions. But Thomas would be the only one who knew the truth. He would later say that his father had rejected him, the same way he felt toward his mother since an adolescent. But surprisingly, his mother was the one to stand by him till the end, a person he had a rocky relationship with his entire life. Following Thomas's phone call, he would be put inside of a holding cell while detectives hit the streets to dig up more evidence, with one of the first witnesses they talked to being the vice president of the firm that the Penn Brothers previously worked for. Then with the tips from the public, news broadcasts, several residents in Churchill and Fulton Hill recognizing a car driven by the Penn Brothers, this led them to Frances and her daughter Verona Oliver. They were shown pictures of the gray Chevrolet, and they would say it was a direct match to the vehicle that William had got into on the day of her birthday party, which was May 20th, and also the same night that James disappeared. This new revelation helped put the missing pieces together about a man that Frances thought she knew all too well. And just like that, William was added to the suspect list that same day, along with the warrant for his arrest. Hours later, going into midday, Henrico County police officers arrested William Penn in the middle of his work shift, charging him in connection with James's murder. They also had a search warrant for his home that he shared with his wife, who was oblivious to her husband's extracurricular activities. And upon searching the house, Detective Baker would find the murder weapon stashed in the washing machine, wrapped inside a towel, and the washing machine was filled up halfway with water. And they also found a number of bullets tucked inside a baby's mitten. Other miscellaneous items included a lighter similar to the one owned by James Carter, a sirloin steak, and 2 round steaks from the same supermarket where James cashed his check. Lastly, 32 rounds of .22 caliber bullets. However, the detectives still had no real evidence to link the pistol nor the ammunition to the crime. Then it wasn't definitive proof that says William was the actual person who brought the pistol home either, along with the groceries stolen from James's car. As of now, both Thomas and William Penn were now in custody, but Thomas had no knowledge of William's arrest. It's about 8 to 9 p.m. as Thomas sat patiently waiting in the interrogation room. Detective Hastings and Detective Wright sat outside the door, contemplating their next move. They eventually sat down with Thomas, asking him if he knew anything about the .22 revolver they had found. But he didn't believe that they actually had the gun. He was saying, I quote, "I don't know whether you got a revolver from over there or not." But they also hadn't shown him the gun yet. One of them asked if they could tell him the serial number to prove it, but he would say again, "Well, I don't know whether you got the revolver from over there or not," doubling down on not believing in their old police tactics and games. And the way Thomas reacted had the detectives thinking that it was the perfect time to now back up their claim. But before they continued their interview, he was allowed to sit and talk with his mother for 20 to 30 minutes. And during this conversation, his mother leveled with him, requesting that her son tell the full and complete truth. And we don't know if he interpreted that as to include his brother or not, or maybe it was the loads of emotion he felt having his mother by his side that finally broke him. His mother leaves the room, then Detective Wright goes to retrieve the revolver, and he laid it down on the table in full view for Thomas. And it took only seconds for him to realize the cold truth. His face expression said it all. He was then asked if he had known who the gun belonged to, and Thomas responds, "It's my brother's gun, William's gun." Then after, he says he wants to tell the truth about everything that he had done, and they advised him that he in fact didn't have to make a statement numerous times over. But still, he would say, "No, I just want to get it over with. I really feel that I need some help." By 9:30 p.m. later that evening, he had given his full confession. He admitted to sexually assaulting a minor, with his own account corroborating the testimony of Johnny May Hicks, detailing every crude act he had carried out, down to the minute. The following day, Monday, May 30th, 1966, Thomas was being held on a $10,000 bond after spending his first night in city jail. Now, in light of what these detectives were told the night before, Thomas, accompanied by 3 members of the homicide squad, decided to travel to D.C., requesting that Thomas showed them where he had hid the second murder weapon. But after a nearly 3-hour drive, it almost seemed impossible to find a weapon inside a city he only visited once. They returned to Richmond about 5:30 p.m. with at least one large brown paper bag. And waiting in front of the jail was a news photographer, but a member of their squad declined to say whether it was the murder weapon or not. So they decided to go around the building, but the photographer caught a last-minute flick of their cruiser pulling off, with 2 detectives in the back seat shielding Thomas's face. One of the only pictures taken of either of the brothers during this entire process. The next day, on May 31st, William wanted to see Detective Hastings, saying that he wanted to talk with him and tell the truth about the whole thing, describing in detail of his own involvement in Moselle Spencer's murder. But he clearly left out way more information than he promised to give, not even knowing that his little brother was in the other room, wrestling with his inner demons, feeling the need to clear his conscience, implicating William along with all the details he decided to leave out. It's now December 15th, 1966, and it was the first day of trial for Thomas Lee Penn. He was dressed down in a dark suit and a white bottom-down shirt with no tie. There were many questions surrounding his so-called mental state, whether he was actually sane or putting on a show. So then came the testimony of Dr. Lordy, and if we remember, this was the very first psychiatrist that Thomas would come to meet, saying, and I quote, "Thomas is about as sick as a person can get." And despite his treatment at Central State Hospital in late '63 and early '64, Thomas's mental condition had just gotten worse. Thomas had deteriorated intellectually, emotionally, and in terms of being more disturbed psychiatrically, basing Thomas's act of killing on his growing impulses that affected his volition. Now, days before the trial, the prosecution ordered 2 doctors to put him under observation for 41 days, subjecting him to usual tests and examinations. They were tasked with determining his current mental and physical condition, and both claimed to find no organic damage to his brain, no mental disturbance. He was more than able to distinguish right from wrong, quoting that they found nothing to indicate that Thomas acted on an irresistible impulse, which was the total opposite of Dr. Lordy's evaluations that started 4 years prior. They would even highlight certain words verbatim to his interview, word combinations that confirmed that they weren't dealing with an illiterate individual, reciting those words in court to be, and I quote, committed to Central State, coping, probably could estimate, accidentally, foster home, news bulletin, made a reservation, respect, paying his last respects to the dead, abandoned farm, disrespectful, psychiatric help, and several more. The prosecutor would then say, the vocabulary of this man and his sentence structure demonstrates that we have before us an individual of average intelligence, certainly of the intelligence that would normally be expected of a person who has completed 9 years of public schooling. Then after, the jury concluded that Thomas Lee Penn was sane, even though it was proven long before the year of 1966 that intelligence was not the sole factor for paranoid schizophrenic diagnosis. But I had assumed that there were questions as to why one set of doctors would get a total different result than his original psychiatrist, Dr. Lordy. And if those questions were asked, they would all go unanswered. If there's another angle to this story, it's the fact that someone had dropped the ball, either purposely or accidentally, but then tried cleaning up the mess they made afterward, and was successful. Maybe they intended on Thomas hurting someone, preferably a colored person, who knows? Because if you were to release a documented mentally ill man out into the streets because of racial bias, is a greater evil all on its own, one that we may never get the full truth about. But there would be someone who saw through the prosecution's facade and racial biases, and that was Thomas's attorney, Richard Ryder. And this was Ryder's argument. I'm not asking you to turn this boy loose, to find him not guilty, because if you did, you'd be doing the same thing that people at Central State did. I'm asking you to find him not guilty by reason of insanity. The only outlet this boy had was in what he had done, and if you turn him loose, he'd do it again tomorrow. Look at the senseless killings, and I think you'll add it up into a total picture of mental insanity. The state has asked you to send this man to the electric chair, to kill him. So what if you do? What if you kill this man? It won't mean anything. He's tried to get help. He's pleaded for help. I know this man is sick. You know this man is sick. I'm not going to quote you what Dr. Lordy has said, what psychiatrists have said. I'm only asking you to use your reason, what this boy has been subjected to all his life. The Commonwealth wants you to use your reason and say this man had no evidence of mental illness, that he was perfectly normal. Look at the crimes he committed. Are these normal? Why did he do these things? The mental health situation in this state is completely inadequate. What would it do to that institution if they had to admit that they were wrong, that they were responsible for these 6 people he killed? But Ryder's enlightening speech did little to persuade an all-white jury to see the error in the hospital's decision to release him in the first place. At Williams' trial in Henrico, his lawyer made the case that he had minimal involvement, and the evidence was all circumstantial at best, and he would eventually plead innocent. The prosecution would use more than 15 witnesses in an attempt to link the death of James Carter and Moselle Spencer with him. So there he stood, almost motionless, as he listened to the indictment which accused him of killing the elder man. But on April 10th through the 11th of 1967, William Penn Jr. was convicted by a jury of first-degree murder, and his punishment fixed at 20 years in the penitentiary. So in all, the brothers shared the weight. The murders that Thomas wasn't charged for, William would bear the brunt of it. Thomas was charged with 6 murders and received light sentences on 4 of them, while the charges of malicious wounding and rape of Johnny May were dismissed. William received another 20-year sentence to run consecutively and a third to run concurrently. This case garnered attention from publications in several other states. So just imagine how quick it would be today for a reporter in California to hear about a major crime in Virginia, which compared to the year of 1966, everything was either word of mouth or an expensive telephone call away using a long-distance operating service. Now if you remember, Thomas had confessed to his final victim, Johnny Mae Hicks, that she was his 20th victim, just before he wrote the message Sniper 20 on both her thighs to mark his body count. And maybe this were a means to intimidate or keep her in line. But from what we've all learned today, he doesn't strike me as a man who would choose that moment specifically to tell a lie. In his mind, she wouldn't be able to repeat those words anyway. I assume this to be true because he would say something just before their closing arguments that was never looked into, investigated, or even taken into consideration. And maybe this was due to Thomas having to spend the rest of his days in prison anyway. But he would be asked by his own attorney, "How many people did you really kill?" And Thomas's response, 6 by myself. And that was just this year. It's a lot to unpack from this story, but I won't do it here. What I will do is ask you guys' opinion, your take on Thomas Penn. There were so many angles you could see inside this story, so many things to factor in as right, wrong, or indifferent. But as for my take on it, the diagnosis of Thomas's original doctor is why I believe in him being a paranoid schizophrenic. Then there was the way he picked his victims, which had no pattern. Some were black, some were white. And I think him sexually assaulting those women, those little girls, came from him having mommy issues, but I could be wrong. So yes, I do think Central State is equally responsible for those murders, just as Thomas. I honestly think it was purposeful, as far as releasing him. And then comes the prosecutor in the courtroom. Now, in no way, shape, or form am I saying Thomas Penn or William Penn was right for what they did, because no matter what life was like back then, unaliving anybody under any of those circumstances that they used to do it was not right, and they are monsters for doing it. Now, as far as Thomas Penn, if he did have a mental illness, it is on the hospital, but other black people were being thrown in there for things just as little as being on the wrong side of the street. How could you really tell at this point, unless you really care? But overall, it doesn't matter whose fault it was then or today, because 6 people lost their lives, while 1 will be traumatized for who knows how long. Rest in peace to the fallen, and y'all stay safe out there.